President Trump's top economic advisor, said some really stupid stuff again. This is according to CNBC. Kudlow calls federal minimum wage a terrible idea. White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow labeled the federal minimum wage a terrible idea, saying it hurts small businesses. He made the statement when asked whether the administration would favor a $15 an hour minimum wage. Kudlow said he applauded Amazon's decision to raise its own workers' pay to that level. Okay, so let's pause for a second here. Applauding Amazon's decision, that's interesting because that was achieved because of Ro Khanna in the House and Bernie Sanders in the Senate basically shaming Amazon into raising the wages. Now, Ro Khanna and Bernie Sanders got shit from everybody for that bill, not only from the right, but also from the left, because on the left they said the way that you structured the bill is shaming people who use our social safety net program, and you shouldn't shame those people. Now, I did a segment where I covered their bill, and I actually gave it praise. And the reason I gave it praise was because of its bipartisan appeal, because the way they framed it was it would massively help left-wing goals to get left-wing goals accomplished, but it does that by co-opting the right's own arguments against them. So what they did is they argued, and I don't know if you could hear that noise. There's some noise in the background. I apologize if you could hear that. What they did is they said, hey, we will tax Amazon 100% for everything that their workers have to get from a social safety net program. So let's say billions of dollars worth of their workers, the social safety nets need to spend billions of dollars, so taxpayers have to spend billions of dollars to help out Amazon's workers. What Ro Khanna and Bernie Sanders said was, okay, well then we're going to tax Amazon 100% for every penny that your workers got from the social safety net program. Now again, the left even said, oh, you're shaming people on social safety net programs and that's not cool. But they missed the point. The point is, in order to really get change, you have to take your opposition's argument seriously and use their own logic against them. And that's what they did. And so what happened was, I'm convinced that Jeff Bezos looked at this bill and thought, oh, wow, it's framed in a way where it can get bipartisan support. And I think Jeff Bezos was scared that this thing would really gain some legs. I mean, it was called the Stop Bezos Act, which is another amazing framing trick on their part, because that makes it so that the media is going to cover it, because they're going to go, holy shit, it's called the Stop Bezos Act. That's crazy. That's radical. That's newsworthy. So it was a win in every conceivable way. The framing was correct in terms of the substance of the bill. The naming of the bill was correct. And it got enough media coverage. I think Bezos was scared, and he was like, okay, I'll voluntarily raise the wages, because he wanted to avoid a law that forces him to do that. But then also, by the way, let's be clear, he also got rid of a benefits program where you can earn extra and get more money on the back end. And that's why we need $15 an hour and a union. But make no mistake about it, that $15 an hour net benefited most of those people. 350,000 workers got a wage increase. So that's super important. Even though it wasn't perfect, it was a giant step in the right direction, and that's why we need $15 an hour and a union. But, so Larry Kudlow's praising that move, which was basically a left-wing move to bully Bezos into raising his wages. It worked, and now Kudlow's like, oh yeah, no, that's a good thing. Dude, this always happens with left-wing ideas. The right will oppose it, and then when we win, they're forced to then turn around and go, oh, no, I was with that all along because it's such common sense and it's so logical that I was always on the side of that. The best example of this is with Martin Luther King Jr., the Voting Rights Act, and the Civil Rights Act. They were so against it, fought it tooth and nail. The conservatives, they were like, no way, never. And then after it passed, cut to 5 years later, they're like, oh, yeah, we were in favor of treating black people equally. Yeah, exactly. And Martin Luther King was a Republican. He was a Republican. He's with us. He believes in what we believe in. He'd be a Rush Limbaugh listener if he was around today. So it's amazing because it shows you how right the left is historically, where after we get our goals, they're like, oh, yeah, and I was with you all along. I mean, come on. And that's what Larry Kudlow is kind of letting on here. He doesn't even realize it. Okay. Now, furthermore, the idea that it would be bad for small businesses, factually wrong. It's just wrong. So it is true that if you raise the minimum wage to an unreasonable level, yeah, that might be bad for small businesses because then the small businesses can't afford the workers that they need, so they're going to lay off some of those workers, so it will increase the unemployment rate. Now, why do I say it's wrong that it would be the case for $15 an hour? Because everywhere around the country where we have raised the minimum wage, it hasn't led to an increase in unemployment. That's not me speaking. That's the objective data. That's the numbers. There's been studies on this. And what happens is when you raise it in a reasonable way, so you say, okay, it's going to be $15 an hour, but we're going to raise it over an extended period of time. Over the next 5 years, it will slowly, gradually increase, and then it will get to $15 an hour by 5 years from now. Well, when you do it that way, that's something that the small business can take if you do it gradually and you get to that $15 an hour point. And that's what the studies show actually functions. So yes, it would be an issue if you just overnight, hey, sorry, I know you're paying $8 an hour now, but you got to go all the way up to 15 and you got to do it overnight. That would probably lead to some layoffs. But if you do it gradually over time, then of course, the studies show that that doesn't happen. So you have to understand that they're wrong on the empirical data. The old theory has always been if you raise minimum wage, no matter what the fuck you raise it, it's going to lead to unemployment. It's going to increase unemployment. It's a terrible idea. But then the study showed that that's not true because you have to do it in a reasonable way. Now let me give you more of what he says here because there's an interesting point of semi-agreement I have with him that we'll talk about. So he says, a federal minimum wage is a terrible idea that hurts small businesses, White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow said Thursday. With midterm elections less than a week away, speculation is building as to what changes might be in store in Washington, D.C. Specifically, Kudlow was asked during a forum on small business how the administration would respond if Democrats press for $15 an hour national minimum wage. Polls indicate that the House is likely to flip Democratic, though the Senate is likely to stay Republican. My view is a federal minimum wage is a terrible idea, terrible, and will damage particularly small businesses, he told a questioner from the Washington Post, which presented the event. To force them to kind of take a payroll increase would be silly. To not pay a living wage would be silly. All right, next. Geography is an important factor when deciding what wages should be, said Kudlow, director of the National Economic Council. Idaho is different than New York. Alabama is different than Nebraska, he said. That's why the federal minimum wage doesn't work for me. The current minimum wage is $7.25, where it has been for more than 10 years. Some Democrats and labor activists have been pushing for the $15 level, which a number of communities have adopted. Kudlow praised Amazon for raising its minimum wage to $15, saying he applauded the move. Okay, now, here's the point of semi-agreement with him. When he says, and I think the left should acknowledge this too, by the way, it's very important that I think we do. When he says, hey, listen, man, this makes no sense because Idaho is different from New York, and New York is different from Nebraska, and Nebraska is different from Alabama. That's true. That's true. So here's the thing about Fight for 15. It has so much momentum, and they're right on the overarching point, okay, that you're not gonna lose that fight politically. I'm fighting for $15 an hour. To come out against that doesn't only sound like political suicide to me for somebody to say it on the left, also on the right, like the center right. Again, raising the minimum wage, you know what that poll's at? 80% of Americans want to raise the minimum wage. So the marketing and the framing behind $15 an hour is totally correct. And listen, I agree with $15 an hour. I do. Now, where Kudlow is right is we have to not pretend that in rural Mississippi and New York City that the cost of living is the same in both of those places, and that it's just as easy for a business owner in New York City to pay $15 an hour as it is for one in rural Mississippi. It's just not the same thing. That dollar value is totally different in those two places. So where Kudlow is obviously wrong is, the federal minimum wage is a bad idea. No, it's not. To have a business and not pay a living wage is a bad idea because we have a term for that. It's called fucking wage slavery, and that obviously should be outlawed. So what's my idea? And I've spoken about this before. Listen, I think that a good compromise, I think the Democrats should go out there pushing for $15 an hour minimum wage, and they should push for that relentlessly and see what happens. See what happens, see what the right counters with and all that stuff, because I think there will be some sort of a give and take in a situation where Democrats have a lot more power in the system. They might counter, we'll do 12, something like that, which, by the way, was Hillary's counter to Bernie back in the 2016 election, but I digress from that. I think a good compromise that actually should become law is a living wage for all law. Okay? Now, what does that mean, and how is that different from $15 an hour? What that means is you would have a federal law that mandates a living wage everywhere in the country. Now, in Montana, that living wage might be $9.25. In New York City, that living wage might be $25 an hour. But living wage for all allows us to be more nuanced as to what the exact wage will be in different places. Now, it's still a little more complicated than that because I don't even think you can do it just by state because Syracuse, a living wage is lower than in the heart of New York City, and they're both in New York State. So what I think is you have to do it either by county or by voting district. And I think that's the only way to do it where you get as close to perfectly accurate everywhere as you can. So I'm in favor of using $15 an hour to fight and for leverage and as a starting negotiation point. And then I think the middle ground where you actually might get it into law is a living wage for all law where, again, that might be in rural Mississippi, $9.25 an hour, but it also might be, whatever, $21 in Chicago or what have you. So that's what I actually support ultimately is a living wage for all law that's crafted in a more nuanced way like that. And this is similar to my Medicare for All philosophy, which is, and if you saw my debate with Scotty Nell Hughes, you know that this was a point I made. I support a Medicare for All system at a federal level. I think perhaps the Democratic starting point should be let's make it like the UK's NHS, which is public funding of public hospitals and institutions. And then from that position, there's gonna be a give and take because this is the way our system works. It's messy. And you always have to deal with the opposition party. And then you can go from that total Medicare for all system like the NHS, and then you could say, okay, fine, not like the NHS. You guys like privatization on the right. Fine, we'll do it more like the Canadian system or the French system, where it's public funding of private institutions. And then I think that the ultimate compromise that would actually be acceptable and would actually work is, okay, fine, no Medicare for all system at a federal level, but we're going to do Medicare for all at the state level. So in other words, a federal law mandating that each respective state, all 50 states, need to come up with their own state Medicare for all system, that they have a state single-payer system all around the country. And there would be no excuses. Mississippi would have to make their own Medicare for all system, their own single-payer system. New York would have to do it, fucking California, Wyoming, so on and so forth. And again, I think politically that's something that actually can get passed. But in order for that to get passed, you need to have the starting point of the Democrats be NHS-style Medicare for all system, everything public. So I know this is super wonky, this segment, but I think it's important to talk about this stuff. And every step of the way, they're going to try to cock-block genuine attempts to ameliorate social ills and economic ills and fixing of the system. And we need to be ready for it. And we need to have our counter proposals ready, and we need to fight aggressively on the main ones. I would fight like hell for actually getting $15. Even though my ideal is a little different. I'd fight like hell for that $15. I'd fight like hell for that Medicare for all NHS-style system. And then, again, the meeting ground needs to be one that makes sense. I'm not in favor of doing the Obama thing, which is start negotiating from the middle and then cave all the way to the right. No. Let's start negotiating from the far left. This is what I always say, guys. I would vote for people way to the left of me. I'd vote for an actual socialist. Why? Because we're not actually going to get, the total... ownership of the means of production, social ownership of the means of production. We're not going to get that. So if I have somebody who believes in that and he fights for that, well, then the meeting ground might be social democracy. The compromise might be social democracy. And that's where my politics are anyway. So this is all nuanced and important and wonky, but I wanted to lay that out for everybody in detail.